All right,
All right.
you can introduce yourself.
Excellent, thanks. So I'm Simon DeDeo. I'm just going to be talking about some work that we've done. This is with Robin Na, who is with us at Carnegie Mellon, and he's now at MIT. This is the paper. It's on the archive. I'm new to CogSci. This is my first time, so here I am. Any case, we're in the reasoning session, and we've heard a talk on the CRT. We've heard a talk about the feelings of understanding we get from explanations in part. I'm going to talk today about arguments. And so arguments are kind of the public versions of the reasons and understandings and feelings we have of getting it that we then release into the world, right? So arguments, you can think of these kind of public objects. They're meant to induce somebody else to adopt a belief. And critically and really interestingly, they may in fact be very different from the reasons that we ourselves have to believe the thing that we believe. So just to flesh that out a little, I'll give you a framework that I found quite useful. This is the Mercier and Sperber argument theory or argumentative theory. So there's a great BBS paper from maybe 10 years ago, Arguments for the Argumentative Theory. And they get a very strong picture about the difference between, let's say, believing or coming to infer something and the arguments that you present to others, right? So on the one hand, you have, some transformations over mental representations, the ways in which you might prefer one explanation over another. And that's quite distinct from the reasons that you provide to others to believe something. So here's just an example. You're talking to a friend and he's really upset because, his friend was just sort of irritated with him. And you say, look, your friend isn't really mad at you. She's just very stressed, right? So this is a belief you have. The way you might convince your friend or calm down your friend or, chill him out, you say, look, here's a reason to believe that she blew up in front of her advisor as well, right? So it can't just be you. But the red task and the blue task are potentially very distinct things. So by studying arguments, we're getting a different perspective onto the ways in which we take beliefs and transform them. It's a critical question, not just for kind of getting into the head of the explainer, but also for understanding how explanations evolve culturally over time, right? I can't actually transfer my knowledge into your brain. I'm going to do so largely by this kind of argument making process. So then we have this puzzle, right? What kinds of arguments do people actually make in the world? So if you look this up, it turns out like we're actually really fuzzy on this. And if you sort of look at the stories that people tell, a lot of it actually comes from freshman classes on like critical thinking, right? So you go to Oxford University Press and they have a little YouTube lecture and it's like, there are 3 types of arguments: deductive, inductive, and abductive, and here's how they work, right? That's, as far as I can tell, sort of largely normative or fake, depending on how charitable you want to be. If you look sort of in the deep history of thinking about arguments as a kind of on the meta level, Tolman, interesting character, has a theory that he presented in 1958, trying to tease apart the different components of an argument. Again, largely normative. So like this is, from his point of view, what a good argument has. And if it's missing pieces, maybe it's just yelling. It's hard to say. More recently, in part because of the Bayesian revolution in CogSci, this is a lovely paper that we found in 2020, Ulrike Hahn, looking at arguments in part in terms of how they might present evidence that adjusts your beliefs in a kind of Bayesian fashion. Less on the public side, more about how you might go about presenting bits and pieces of evidence, which of course itself is kind of interesting. So that's the puzzle. What Robin and I did was we just said, look, let's just go out into the wild. Let's just be ecologists about this. And we had 2 broad questions. First, what are the patterns in the arguments that people actually make? So let's go look at argument making that people, take on. And then what are the effects of those arguments on their interlocutors? So do they actually, how do they actually work to convince people? We have an unusual data set. This is from Reddit. So this is a wonderful website called Change My View. If you feel sad about the human race, I suggest going here. So how does this work? People get on this website and they say, look, here's this view I hold, right? This is what I believe, something I believe, and maybe it's a bit edgy. And change my view. So here's an example. Somebody will post this point of view they have here. And then they explicitly solicit people to give them arguments that will alter their point of view. So this would be a possible counter argument here, or an argument that somebody makes to induce the person. And then, remarkably enough, not only do we get to see somebody's view and arguments that people make to try to convert the person or shift their point of view. It's also possible for the OP, the original poster, to come back and rate the arguments. And in fact, what they will do is they'll flag an argument and be like, oh, actually, thank you very much. That did indeed change my view. And they flag it with this, let's see here. They flag it with this delta. So for every argument, we often have a number for every view, every sort of belief that somebody states. We have a bunch of arguments, and then some of them are then flagged as viewpoint changing arguments. This is online data, so it's quite remarkable. We have 100,000 views that people have posted on Reddit in our data. And then we have 5 million replies to that view, counter arguments or arguments that people are making in order to convert the person. If you want to know the success rate of arguments on the internet, it's 1%. So about 1% of these things here, of the replies, are flagged as changing the person's view. Right, so that's our data set. It's a remarkably large one. It's uncontrolled in some sense. The moderation is actually really good, so people get rid of the spam that's floating around. There's all sorts of rules about, okay, if you post here, you have to stick around for 3 hours, and if the OP is not sticking around long enough, then the moderator will actually hide the viewpoint and just stop the debate. So we actually have a pretty good control. So what did we do? How did we actually track the argument patterns? We wanted to get away from the semantics. We didn't want to see like, okay, what evidence do people present, but rather the context in which they present evidence or whatever they're going to do. What we do is we begin with a set of sort of fragment or function words. We start with the Luke data set of lists of words associated with certainty, for example. This is by James Pennebaker, and it's sort of continuously updated. So little fragments like usually, generally, option, things like that. We do a little NLP. One of the things we found was quite powerful was looking not just at words in isolation, but also how they combine together. So not just, agree, but mostly agree, not just notice, but notice that, these little fragments. And then we look for co-occurrences among those little fragments and try to cluster those co-occurrences. So what that means is some of these little bigrams and unigrams tend to go together, like they tend to be used. If you're making an argument, a bunch of these will show up at once. We cluster them together. And then at the other side, we get a set of clusters of these little fragments that tend to go together. And in fact, our clustering mechanism tells us the number of these clusters that seem to be sitting in the data. Our word lists are kind of fun. One of the ways that this project began was in part noticing when we were studying kind of crazy people on the internet that we don't just see argument patterns associated with the semantics, but also these kind of weird function things like argument, point, wrong, said, logic, saying, things like that are floating around. So how many argument patterns are there? Was Oxford University Press right? Well, the answer is there's 6, at least according to us. So there's 6 sort of distinctive patterns of how people deploy these little fragment words in any particular context. So if you look here, we do indeed find there is a pattern that's largely associated with the deductive certainty, like you can't prove this, or it's objectively true, it doesn't change, or firstly, like that's just an opinion. We also have a kind of induction one referring to sort of the probabilities of things happening. So it's quite possible, it's more likely, things like that. We may have a pair that are sort of abductive, right? They begin sort of evidentiarily, and then they kind of back out into the larger set of beliefs. I'll just show you, I should have made this a handout. This is sort of examples. Each of these things here is just a fragment of one of the arguments somebody's made. And then we've highlighted in red the little word pairs that are associated with flagging them as one type versus another. So you can see like, let's take a look at deduction and certainty, right? If you do accept that all the facts are reported with, or maybe with bias, and the question becomes this, these kind of certainty transformations. That's just one example. So those are the large-scale patterns we're finding. Here's their differential power, right? Because as you remember, we have this way to track not just the arguments that people are making, but also whether or not they get flagged as changing somebody's point of view. So here are the 6 patterns. One is relevance, definitions, deduction, causation and examples, induction and personal. If you want to change somebody's mind, my recommendation is you talk in terms of causation and examples. So the probability boost of changing someone's point of view with the causation pattern is about 23%. Sort of coming up next is a pattern we call the personal anecdote pattern. So it's examples, but they're first person examples. So in my experience, so-and-so is the case, that kind of thing. The induction pattern talking about things being more or less likely. Oh, it seems more reasonable that this is true. It's more likely that this is true. That's the third pattern that kind of boosts you above the average. On the flip side, these are the bad argument patterns, how to lose an argument on the internet. So deduction, sort of reasoning in this very logical fashion, transforming one certainty into another. That's deduction, not good. Arguing about definitions, not good. And arguing about sort of relevance. It's kind of this Gricean thing where it's like, look, you know, you're talking about abortion as this social justice thing, but that's just not relevant, right? It's actually, this is murder, right? This line here, I mean, sorry, I should have said you should focus on this line here. This is the all case. This is all the arguments. Robert and I were a little bit worried, like, okay, maybe if you're arguing about, let's say, art, it's easier to convince somebody, and, you know, art arguments are sort of, I don't know, about personal experience. Happily, that turns out not to be true. So what we can do is look at the semantics of the arguments as well. So we filter out the words associated with the argument patterns and just look at the remaining semantic words. So here, for example, these are arguments with words that, you know, including things like black, white, and culture. So this is, you can tell what people are arguing about here, talking about race. The patterns persist regardless of the semantics. There's a couple interesting ones. You'll notice here, induction actually doesn't work. This is a case where induction actually fails. It's one of the kind of exceptions. We think what's going on there is that when you're arguing about race, people don't like talking about certainty, or sorry, people don't like talking about probabilities, in part because it may have something to do with stereotypes, right? It's like, oh, black people are more likely, right? Here's another example. This is sort of the meaning of life questions, you know, humans, what's moral, why do we exist? In this case here, you can see deduction is maybe not as popular, but overall the patterns are remarkably stable. Let's do a little cross-system validation. Anyone know less wrong? These are people who think that the artificial intelligence will eat and destroy the world. So very high-level discussions, a little crazy. But we can run the same pattern detection on those, the word fragments. We can just look in any corpus. I'm happy to talk to you about how you can do this with your own data, even experimental data, because we just need these word fragments. We don't need a lot to classify the argument that somebody's making. What we find is, and in this case with less wrong, they don't flag yes or no. We can study the upvotes, downvotes. We see broad similarities between the change my view case and the less wrong case. Interesting differences at this point. We still see the personal anecdote is a popular one. Interestingly, though, less wrong doesn't like probabilistic arguments. Some differences here between how people rate a post, like, ooh, nice comment, versus, ooh, nice comment, and it changed my view. So induction turns out to be maybe less successful just in gaining overall ratings. Not sure about that. Final thing I'll talk about is we looked a little bit into individual differences in argument making patterns. So we take people who've made enough arguments that we can start to track their preferences for one versus another. We have so much data that we can actually focus just on the people who've made 20 or more posts on the site. We find if we do a very simple PCA, we find there's a principal component here of argument preference, which is personal versus impersonal. So some people, when they get online and they're arguing with people online trying to change their views, they talk largely in terms of personal experience. That's the primary axis of variation. There's a secondary axis. So this is maybe 70% of the variance here. Another 20% of the variance is concrete versus abstract, right? So are you a kind of person who talks about examples, maybe talks about probabilities, this is more likely than that, versus things like, well, if X, then Y. Let's definitionally talk about, well, what is a man, what is a woman, that sort of thing. So first axis, second axis, and some interesting results in terms of how this actually works to convince people. So with this slightly more skilled set of the 20, people who posted 20 comments or more, it turns out actually that now we can start to see a preference for the concrete impersonal. That seems to be the most successful for the skilled arguers. Open questions that we're quite excited about. We're excited about many things, but some open questions. So experimental work. So what arguments do people use, in, let's say, a laboratory case where we can really start tracking and varying the different conditions under which people are making those arguments, both the thing they're arguing about and maybe the interpersonal conditions, right? So what happens, for example, like, do you start talking about relevance when the communication breaks down? Versus if you feel more comfortable, you feel there's trust, you might prefer personal arguments. Another question really interesting to me, right? How do argument patterns co-vary with the degree of belief of the argument maker, right? So if I really believe something, do I prefer, let's say, the personal or the example-based argument, or do maybe I go over to more sort of logical stuff like, yes, God exists because everything has to have a cause, something like that, right? So are there preferences there for how we argue for things depending upon our degrees of belief? And finally, which argument patterns is something I was talking about with Tyler Margulis yesterday. In this case, like some of these belief revisions may be really large, others might be quite mild, right? So, change my view, like, I don't know, frequent to statistics is kind of lame, right? So people have been talked out of that. It might not be a huge belief revision, but change my view, God exists. What are the kinds of arguments that are effective in achieving like a real whole scale revision in someone's belief system, right? So we can look at success, but in the change my view data, we don't have sort of magnitude. I'll end there. I'm happy to take questions. And thank you very much.